What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to another edition of the Jays for Days podcast. I'm Josh. He's Josh. We got Jays Jumpers, Jaron Jackson Jr.'s, John Morant's, Joe Johnson's, Ja Raff's, of course. Josh, it's finally here. We get to talk about the basketball that's going to happen next season. Instead of talking about the basketball that's already happened, it's very, very exciting. Josh, how are you?
It is truly one of the highlights of the year when we get to start our conference previews. I know we both got so excited we started working ahead just so we got to do more of it.
Exactly.
But we get our first guest today, which is
We do get our first guest today. We instead of being married to a order in which we preview conferences, basically we're just going to preview conferences in the order that we have people to talk about them with. Hence, instead of starting with the ACC and chronological order, we're starting with the Big East in week one of our conference previews. Of course, you've already heard Josh and I's conversation about the conference, but now we bring in a guy that is no stranger to this podcast or the Big East. Lukas Harkins, Hardwired Sports on Twitter. Lukas, my guy, how are you?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on, guys.
You know, we really had an intentional conversation about people we could potentially get for the Big East, and then just kind of came to the conclusion that not only do we have we're already friends with you and know you well, but B, we just decided this is the right answer anyway. We're not going to make this more complicated than it needs to be. So thanks for coming back on.
I appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
And now we've laid all of the pressure on your shoulders.
Right.
So make sure to not mess it. No, I'm kidding. So let's start in the place that a lot of people will start with the Big East this year, and that's the fact that not only does the Big East have a lot of new coaches this year, the Big East has a lot of high profile new coaches for lots of different reasons, whether it's Shaheen Holloway and doing what he did at St. Peter's, whether it's Thad Matta returning to Butler as a guy that has an alarmingly high win percentage as a college basketball coach, or Sean Miller coming back to Xavier and coaching for the first time since everything that happened at Arizona. I guess, just on the surface, and then we'll kind of get into different aspects of the coaching changes. How big of a shakeup is the new coaching roster in the Big East and what they're bringing to the conference this upcoming season?
Yeah, and you don't even mention maybe the most important one of the offseason.
Oh, and
Jay Wright retiring.
Right, and that one too. Sorry.
Yes. So it's a huge shakeup, and I think kind of all of it together creates a better competitive balance maybe within the conference. That isn't to say that Kyle Neptune's not going to be a great head coach at Villanova. It's just replacing Jay Wright is going to be an impossible task for anybody because that's a program legend in every sense of the term. And I think really Seton Hall's a little bit different. It's a changing of coaching, but I don't think necessarily the program was in bad shape before either. I think Seton Hall's going to remain very solid. Kevin Willard was successful there, and I think Shaheen will be successful there too, perhaps for different reasons, but successful regardless. And for Xavier and Butler, I think it's probably two of the programs with really good program tradition, more localized. And I think that bringing back bigger name head coaches that have had success at their programs and at big name programs, for both that at Ohio State and Sean Miller at Arizona had success, really raises the profile for programs that really should have raised profiles in the Big East. And neither one has necessarily made those postseason jumps that we thought some could. Butler made its runs in the Rise League. Xavier has had some really good regular season teams, but hasn't really made those runs in the postseason, where I think that Miller and Mata have the potential to give the Big East, not just to join the likes of Creighton and UConn as well, gives the Big East more teams that have second weekend potential, or more programs that have second weekend potential in the next 5 or 7 years than it has been in the past, where it's pretty much been Villanova.
Is there one of those four coaching changes you listed that you look at and expect to be the most impactful right away? You talked about the long-term implications of it, and certainly there's validity to that. But specifically looking at this season, is there? I mean, I guess it's hard for Kyle Neptune to have a massive positive impact considering what he's inheriting. But is there one of those guys that you feel like there's going to be a massive jump from last season to this season, in part because of that coaching hire?
Yeah, I think both Xavier and Butler are in that camp for different reasons, though. I think Xavier's had talent. It's been close. They just really fumbled down the stretch for 4 straight years,
Right.
where they realistically could have made the tournament all those years, and they missed every year, and would have missed in the COVID year because of their loss in the Big East tournament to DePaul. Or at least I think they would have missed regardless. They would have been in those first 8 teams out probably. And I think they still have that talent this year. They bring back a great front court. Nungy's back, Fremantle's back. I think Colby Jones is probably an all-conference guy this year, and I think he might be their best player. He was really good in the NIT. I think he takes another jump this year to be probably a second teamer in the Big East. And I think for Butler's in a place where they've obviously struggled the last 2 seasons. But there's been flashes, and there's that young core that's there. With Chuck Harris, Jaden Taylor, Simas Lukosius. I think a healthy Miles Tate is probably part of that core too, as a reserve guy. And I think part of why I'm optimistic with Thad Matta coming in is Thad Matta really did a good job in the transfer portal. He got a lot of guys that really changed the way Butler can play. I think you look at Butler in the Big East, has had success. It had success under Chris Holtman, a really good year with Kamar Baldwin and LaVale Jordan. But none of that is associated with rim protection. Every single time it felt like, as a Butler fan or someone who follows Butler, it kind of just felt like every time Butler was matched up with UConn the last 2 years, like this isn't going to go well. Just because UConn had so much size, it was that kind of matchup that I think Butler won't have as much problems with this year. Just by adding Manny Bates and Dalen Thomas, their defense can really change. And that aspect, I think Butler's probably taking a leap from more towards the bottom of the conference into the bubble conversation, whereas Xavier takes that jump from bubble conversation into second weekend.
When it comes to Xavier, how much stumbling down the stretches, was it more Travis Steele in your opinion than it was what was happening on the court, or are there things that, in addition to Sean Miller coming in, that you need to see from what actually Xavier is putting on the court with those guys to kind of take that next step into not underachieving? Or is the coaching change going to do a lot of that?
I think it's kind of a combo. I think if Travis Steele was back this season, I think there's something to be said for the guys who know last year at least, or 2 years ago, were places where they could have been in the NCAA tournament and missed it. There's some of that unfinished business where maybe Travis Steele would have gotten them back to the tournament this year anyways. But I think Sean Miller he's already brought a ton of recruiting success this summer. I think that's already increased the fan experience for Xavier right now. And I think they're going to come into the year with high expectations as a fringe top 25, maybe top 35 team in the country. And I think that's about right. I think they've got a lot of really nice pieces. Desmond Claude coming in as a freshman, I think is going to play big minutes for them too. I like Suli Boom in the backcourt. They've got options. I think that they're probably going to take – I don't know if it's necessarily a changing in coaching that'll change the late season thing, but maybe it is. But I just think it's unlikely they're going to have another collapse, I feel like. It's just they're due for a breakthrough. And I think it's a breakthrough that puts them in single-digit seed conversation and maybe can make a deeper run.
Looking at the conference as a whole, where do you see it stacking up nationally? I just feel like there's some interesting questions heading into the season in terms of, right, you've got these high profile coaches coming in. How is that all going to work? Villanova's roster is not, bringing back a first team All-American caliber guy, and you have a new coach there. Creighton is also on paper looking really, really good with a proven coach in Greg McDermott. Where do you feel like heading into the season, the Big East sits with the other high major conferences?
Yeah, I think this kind of comes down to how much do you trust Creighton to be a top 10 team in the country? Because they're probably that team at the top right now that really qualifies as a national title contender. But they're also not traditional in that sense. They're not one of the teams that's always in that conversation. They haven't really made deep runs. They made a Sweet 16 this past year, but that really is their deep run in recent history. So I think it really comes down to how much you believe in this Creighton group, and I'm not quite sure I'm there yet. I think they're more of a top 10 kind of team, top 10, 15. I have them closer to Nova nationally than I do like the top five. So I think it comes down to that. But I think overall, they're probably still, the Big East is probably still sitting in that fourth or fifth best conference in the country range. I mean, you got the Big 12, Big 10, SEC are probably a little bit higher in that category. And then the ACC this year has those top dogs. I mean, North Carolina is probably going to be the preseason number one team in the country. And Duke, as long as they get Dariq Whitehead back from injury early enough in the season and he gets chemistry together, they're going to be really good again. So they're probably in that fifth in the country range in terms of conferences.
Do you believe in Creighton's sizable jump on the offensive end? Right,
Yeah.
because that's the thing that right they're either a mainstay in the top 25 or if they're closer to a national title contender, that end of the floor is going to be the reason why.
And really, it's behind the arc to me. I mean,
Right.
they weren't a very good 3-point shooting team last year. And they lost their two best shooters in Ryan Hawkins and Alex O'Connell. Obviously, bringing in Baylor Shireman is honestly, there could not be a better fit for a big time transfer who really did everything for South Dakota State and won't have to do that for Creighton, but he has those ancillary skills. I mean, he shot 47% from three last year in pretty high volume with the Jackrabbits. Like he's got that skill where if he's asked to play make, he can. If he's really just going to be their primary 3-point shooter, then he'll do that just fine. So I think it'll come down to an extent if Arthur Kaluma and Ryan Nembhard can really stretch the floor a little bit better. I know there's talks of Ryan Kalkbrenner stretching a little bit more this season too. Francisco Farabello comes in from TCU as a guy who can kind of shoot it as an off-ball guy, and Mason Miller obviously has the bloodlines of being a really good shooter. So I think that's kind of really Creighton really is kind of that mystery box top 10 team where like they could be awesome, but we also don't really know if they're going to be awesome.
Is any part of your hesitation related to the sort of track record of Creighton in terms of that's what fascinates me about this team in particular is they're the complete opposite of what you associate Creighton with, right? It's they're going to shoot the lights out, they're going to take a bunch of threes, but they aren't consistent enough defensively to go win 3, 4, 5 games in March when it matters because you're not going to shoot 38% from three every game. This team has it all together defensively, and the 3-point shooting is the question. Does that sort of the change in blueprint factor at all into how you view this team and what they could end up being?
Maybe to an extent. I think part of it is just Creighton is the team that's exceeded preseason expectations better than any team in the Big East since the new Big East. If you look at the coaches poll versus where they finish in conference records, nobody has exceeded expectations more than Creighton. And this year they're going to enter number one. They're really in a different territory than they've been before. And they also are entering that territory without having done it before. They didn't do it last year. It's not like they're returning as the Big East reigning champs. It's a lot falling on a sophomore class that was good last season, but not like blow out of the water returning. But I think that it's a lot of can they take the next steps from being good players to great players? That's like all of them to hit the really high ceiling. And I think that there's a lot of fun with that group, and I think that part of that has overshadowed the fact that Ryan Kalkbrenner might be the Big East Player of the Year. But so I think you make a good point. But it really isn't really a difference in scheme because it really just comes down to can they fit their scheme? Is there shooting to bring back the offense they've had from a few years ago while maintaining what was a really, really good defense last year?
So you said that Villanova and Creighton in your national rankings much closer together than certainly Creighton to the kind of those elite national title contenders. Do you feel the same way in the Big East with the way that a regular season title might shake out? Is it just Creighton and Villanova and then there's a drop off? How are you looking at the top of the conference along with Creighton heading into the year?
Yeah, those are definitely my two favorites. They're not the only ones that I'm really giving top 25 consideration to. I think UConn and Xavier are both in that mix. UConn obviously brings back a proven star and another probably a likely preseason player of the year front runner, Donald Sanogo. And they also have a breakout star coming back in Jordan Hawkins. So I think they're probably in that mix. I think UConn's probably the team that's the biggest threat to those top two in the preseason. And then Xavier, we'll see how much the coaching change really impacts them. And if Colby Jones takes that next step, and if Zach Freemantle can get back to who he was before the injury.
One of the things we do on our preview is we identify the team we're most excited by and most intrigued by in every conference. Doesn't have to mean you think they're actually going to be good. You might just find them really interesting. What teams kind of stick out to you now that we've mentioned a decent amount of them, or that you're just sort of interested in to see what they can be? Doesn't necessarily have to do anything with their expectations.
I mean, St. John's is wildly interesting. I really don't know what to make of this team. I mean, they're probably going to start 4 guys who shot under 30% from three last year. They have a really good defensive point guard, maybe the best perimeter defender in the country in Posh Alexander. Andre Curbelo, a former preseason All-American type guy last year who never really lived up to that at Illinois, had some turnover issues, but comes into a position where he gets to play alongside another playmaking guard. He'll show some flashes. Montez Mathis is back. David Jones as an intra-conference transfer from DePaul, who could be an all-conference guy if St. John's is good. And I think Joel Soriano is kind of ready for a bigger jump this year after he put together like pretty modest numbers a year ago. But they're super interesting because just from a sheer player-by-player standpoint, there's a lot of talent on this group that can make the NCAA tournament. But also, Mike Anderson has just kind of put together pretty middle-of-the-road Big East team so far, and this team just doesn't have shooting on paper. And obviously, paper is what it is. If they come out this season and they start shooting the 3-ball well and their defense turns into more than just the occasional turnover, but they actually stop guys at the rim too, they can be super dangerous. It's just a matter of how can everything really come together for them especially after losing Champagne too.
I will refuse to believe in an Andre Curbelo-led basketball team until I see it. I refuse. Maybe that's not fair to Posh Alexander, but that's a guy – like he's the epitome of sometimes it's so bad you like want to look away, but you can't just because it's so mesmerizing. But at the same time, and I'm very quick to be short on Andre Curbelo and my faith in him. But right, there were times 2 years ago, like that's why it was going to be like Curbelo was one of the big reasons why Illinois was going to be okay after Io left. After I went to the NBA, it was like, yeah, but look at what Curbelo did last year, or what he did this year, step into a bigger role. And then, right, there was some injury stuff, and then it just kind of never turned into the season it was supposed to. But all of a sudden, I'm terrified to put any faith into that guy until I see him maybe just take care of the basketball. I don't know.
They're really just an extremely interesting team, and they're really hard to place because, quite frankly, if everything comes together, they could be a top 4 or 5 team in the Big East.
Mm-hmm.
They could also turn into a fireball in a hurry. Like I have almost no idea what to expect from St. John's coming in this year. Outside, I think consistency of Mike Anderson is not necessarily a compliment either. Mm-hmm. But the consistency of Mike Anderson coach teams probably leads me to believe they're sitting around the bubble as probably the 6th to 9th best team in the league.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, see, and that's all I'm right there with you. You picked up exactly kind of what we're trying to get at when we talk about exciting and intriguing, right? It's the idea of St. John's has a track record of rosters that are somewhat at least interesting, if not flat out exciting, that don't really live up to expectations. And now you have thrown Andre Curbelo and the wild card he is into that mix. It could just go any direction. Speaking of transfers, we'll just continue on to in that vein. There are a good deal of teams, including St. John's, but certainly not limited to St. John's, that are going to be heavily reliant on the transfers they're bringing in, whether it's just simply a guy at Creighton like Baylor Shireman or a series of 2, 3, 4 guys for some other teams. What group of transfers do you feel like in this conference is going to end up being the most important when we look back on this season?
Yeah, I think that really comes down to who you really believe in being very good. Because I think two teams really stand out in that group, but also I hesitate to not include Creighton because I think Baylor Shireman has the potential to be the guy that takes Creighton from very good to elite title contender, which I think even as just one transfer addition and Farabello as well, but really just one like high profile addition in Baylor Shireman, he has the potential to be the most important transfer in the entire conference because of how important taking the leap from great to excellent really can be. But I think the other two are Providence and Butler. Providence proved it last year with a really transfer laden roster, put together a really good season, obviously, like in one of the best seasons in regular season history for the Friars. I think we're kind of hoping for a rerun with an entirely different cast for the most part this year. I mean, they bring in Noah Locke, Devin Carter, Bryce Hopkins, Corey Ford, Clifton Moore. I mean, it's a ton of new faces that are probably all going to be in the rotation around Jared Bynum and Eddie Crosswell, who former transfers in their own right. So I think there's a lot to really kind of fit together with Providence, and I think a lot of the preseason, not necessarily hype, because it's not like they're getting preseason top 25 votes, but the reason to believe in them as an NCAA tournament team and maybe a top 5 finish in the Big East is what happened last year. And it's an interesting way of looking at things because a lot of times we talk about what happened last year gives us hope for this year because they bring back talent and like they made steps forward and like they'll take another leap. Whereas Providence is, well, they did it last year with a group of transfers. Can Ed Cooley do it again? And I think that he's earned the benefit of the doubt that he can. And Jared Bynum is, sixth man of the year in the conference last year, but he was also still second teamer. He's one of the better returning point guards in the league, and he'll take another step this year. They're super interesting, and Butler is probably in the same right, just a little step below. I mean, and different because Butler's transfer class is realistically probably going to fill out 3 of the 5 starting spots. Eric Hunter Jr. probably starts at the point. Bring Aaliyah Lee in from Akron, who plays at the 4, big body, more of a 3, but he's 6'8". He can really fill out the 4 size wise and defensively. Not much of a rebounder, but that's where you hope. Manny Bates coming in from NC State missed pretty much all of last season, save for 45 seconds or so. It can really make a difference. And Jalen Thomas arrives from Georgia State as another big that can help offset some of Lee's rebounding issues. So I think that those are two teams that really have a ton of transfers that if the transfers come together, they're not only important pieces of potential NCAA tournament teams, but they're a lot of starters.
Do you know where Providence finished in luck rankings at KenPom last year? Yeah.
First.
Which is and I don't even really know what the takeaway from that is there because right when it's Ed Cooley, there has to at least be some benefit of the doubt there, but it's right. It's a team that finished 27-6 that based on the games that they played and how close a lot of those games were. I mean, we could have lost 11 games relatively easily, 9 games. I mean, it was a super intriguing season, and they did a lot of things like win close games with a team that hadn't been together very long, and we're kind of running it back in a similar fashion to your point, with a lot of new faces and a lot of new, more important faces that are going to be key to Providence having another, top half of the conference year in the Big East.
Yeah, and I think that the luck number of being number 1 gets tossed around really interestingly to me. It's just like we talk about Providence taking a step back because they were so lucky last year. That's not going to happen again. Yet we talk about the team that finished 28th in the country in luck last year and went 23-12 as a 9 seed, Creighton, as a like preseason top 10 team in the country.
Sure.
I think it's interesting. It's just kind of picking out like the fact is 4 of the top 7 teams in luck ratings made the NCAA tournament last year.
Mm.
The phrase "it's better to be lucky than good" is overused, but it certainly helps to be good and lucky.
Yeah.
You got to put yourself in a position to be lucky, right? I feel like that, if nothing else, that's what Providence did last season. They were just there in every game, giving themselves a chance to win in those final few possessions, and just happened to.
And they made plays every
right,
time.
exactly.
It really felt like every time they were going to make a play.
The other part of this I want to touch on quickly is the bottom of this conference. I'm looking at the DePauls, Georgetowns, Marquettes of the world.
That's an insult.
And, well, here's the point I want to make with this, though, and get your thoughts. Georgetown has, you talk about random collection of players. I mean, Georgetown might have the most random collection in the country with all of the transfers and completely rebuilt roster, but a lot of guys who have high major experience and some high major success there, trying to completely forget about what happened last season. DePaul, yes, DePaul lost a lot, but you've got a couple interesting transfers. You still have Nick Ongenda. There, I would argue there is at least some hope. And then Marquette, yes, you lost a lot. You were hoping not to lose Justin Lewis. Mm-hmm. But there are plenty of players coming back, and I think what you were getting at is this is also Shaka Smart, and you might not want to bet against him and bet against this Marquette program. I just picked those three teams in particular, but I feel like the bottom of this conference might not be as bad as it typically is. I don't see a team where you quickly identify them as a 1 or 2 win team in conference, like has been the case. It feels like in the past 5 or so seasons between DePaul and Georgetown. Am I way off on that?
Yeah, I don't know. It's tough because I think some of that's swayed by the fact that Georgetown went 0-19 last year. Like, who was second lowest in wins last year? Butler and DePaul both won 6 games. Like, that's really not that bad. Now, obviously, each of those took 2 from Georgetown. But I think that there's something to be said for the bottom. Just really hasn't been that bad. It was just bad last year at the way bottom. Like, DePaul won 15-16 last season. And won its fair share of games, particularly at home. They kicked up wins over Seton Hall, St. John's, and Marquette. So I think we'll probably see an improved bottom, partially because I just think there's better balance throughout the league. Like, there really isn't that much of a difference, I think, between 4 and 8. Reasonably, I could see kind of going any which way.
What? That never happens in the Big East.
Of course not. Like, with the way that it is, I think that is 4 through 8. Like, I don't think 4 is going to be a top 25 team. Like, I think there's probably 3 top 25 teams in the league. So when the 4th best team and the 8th best team are probably somewhere between 30 and 50 nationally, those are beatable teams, especially at home for the bottom of the league.
On the other side of it, how many wins is going to win the conference, right? In theory, if the bottom of the conference is a little better, there aren't as many wins to go around for the top of the conference. I mean, last year we're looking at, 14-3, 16-4 in conference. Like, that's a lot of conference wins. Is it? And granted, that's a 20 game schedule, so it's a little different. But
province plays 17.
Right, for some teams, right. But are we going to be in kind of the same 16 ballpark again? Maybe something closer to 14-6, 15-5. Than we were last year.
I like 15-5, maybe 16-4, but I like 15-5, 16-4 is one of those 2 spots.
I want to talk to you about the best players in this conference. Because the only guy coming back from a first team All Big East a year ago is Adam Sanogo. And on top of that, right, the one thing that we're always sure about going into a Big East season, at least it's felt that way for the last, 10 years, is, oh yeah, that guy's going to be like an All-American caliber guard. And he's been in college for 3 years, and you just kind of know who that guy is, whether it's, Colin Gillespie the last couple of years, Jalen Brunson, maybe it's a combination of Marcus Howard and Miles Powell. I don't see that guard this year in terms of, that's the kind of the backcourt guy that's going to define the group as a conference. And then just in general, right, who are the guys that are going to kind of fill out that first team All Big East, the guys that we look back and think, okay, yeah, those are the guys that kind of defined the conference this year. At the end of it, and it's a group that needs to be filled because it's pretty empty based on who left last year.
Yeah, I think that guy that you talk about that's missing this year is sitting on the sidelines from an Achilles injury until probably January. And Justin Moore, I think he's probably that guy if he's healthy Kind of feels like that. Ryan Arcidiacono is gone. Here's Colin Gillespie. Colin Gillespie's gone. Here's Justin Moore.
Right.
Kind of thing. And I think in that absence, I actually have 2 Villanova guys on my first team all conference still. So to kind of run that through, my first team all conference in preseason, I think is Jared Bynum's back as an all conference guy last year. I think he steps into a bigger role this season, even as a starter.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's a safe pick. My 2 Villanova guys, I went with Caleb Daniels. I think that he's going to take a big leap. I know Gillespie was high on him taking a potential Big East Player of the Year this year in a bigger role. Former transfer who's really going to be going to be the experienced piece of the backcourt for them this year,
right.
Especially while Moore is out for non-conference and probably part of the conference schedule. And then obviously Villanova's had kind of a mixed history with top 50 recruits in the past. Obviously, there's been guys who have been super successful and others that just haven't really found it or they had injury issues. But Cam Whitmore is as electric as there is in the freshman class. He's got an incredibly physically prepared body for the Big East, and he's just unbelievably explosive. I think he's going to be a really, really good piece for them. Obviously, as you already mentioned, Sonogo is a first-teamer lock. Like, just set it in stone. If he's not a first-team all Big East guy, I'll be shocked. And then the guy who was probably snubbed from an all-conference team, second-team selection last year was Ryan Kalkbrenner,
right? Yeah.
Who I think is probably going to be in the mix, not only for a first-team selection, but a Defensive Player of the Year selection, maybe a Big East Player of the Year selection. I think he's going to be he's up there with the most impactful two-way players in the country. I think he'll compete with Sonogo for the Player of the Year award for most of the year.
See, this is kind of a tangent, but we've been joking about this idea that if you're going to pull out a preseason All-American first team, you might as well just put 5 centers on there. Mm-hmm. And, have Drew Timme playing point guard with Trace Jackson Davis at shooting guard or something. And even in a conference, I guess this is just a conversation about bigs, but this idea that even in a conference that doesn't have those 5 guys you would identify as the 5 best bigs in the country, we're still talking about Sonogo and Kalkbrenner as 2 of the obvious picks to be some of the best players in the Big East. Do you feel like this conference is going to be, and you've talked about Manny Bates at Butler, you can go down the list, what Xavier has returning in the front court. Do you expect even this conference, which isn't necessarily associated with, this era of the bigs and all the guys in the Big Ten and Timmy and all that, to be just as dominant on the interior based on who's coming back and sort of the guys who might take that next step?
I chuckle a little bit as I look at 5 guards on my second team All Big East. So to an extent, yes, I think Sonogo is probably as difficult to guard as anybody in the conference. But I think to counteract your point is the bigs in the conference that really added or are like rising into bigger roles this season are really defensively oriented. Like you mentioned Manny Bates at Butler, like he's a guy who can help limit a guy like Sonogo. And Kalkbrenner is obviously a proven commodity, but in that same mold as a guy who's a really, really good defender who can really step into that. Anjenda's back after averaging almost 2 blocks a game. Curtis Wahab is back after having, blocking a fair amount of shots at Georgetown a few years ago. I think even Ed Crosswell coming into a bigger role at Providence, he was for stretches obviously played fewer minutes than Nate, but for stretches played better last season for them. I think there's just a lot of depth in terms of defensive bigs in the league where it won't necessarily be as offensively dominated outside of those couple that I think have really proven themselves already in Sonogo, Kalkbrenner, and then Jack Nunge as well.
Okay, so who are your second team all guards then?
So it's a little tricky because I think some of these selections here can go a lot of different ways. Like I think I put Colby Jones on my second team from Xavier. I'm really high on Colby Jones getting into how well he played, not only in the NAT, but his last 10 games overall of last season. He really put up bigger numbers, really took on a bigger role. I think he's going to probably take on a lot of ball handling this year with a team that doesn't really have a true point for the Musketeers. So I gave him the slight edge, but I wouldn't be remotely upset if anyone put Jack Nunge on the second team. I think he probably might even belong over guys that I'd other mentioned. But I have Xavier put in 4th in the league, so I really just wanted to make it one guy on the second team. So he's the guy I picked there. Jordan Hawkins is probably the breakout guy of the league. At UConn, I think I have them finishing in the top 20. I have them in my preseason top 25. I think he's probably that second fiddle for Sonogo. I can see him getting up towards that 14 points a game kind of range this year. And I kind of feel the same way about Chuck Harris at Butler, taking another step this season. He's got more help around him. Won't have as much pressure to have to self-create, which I think has been part of the issue with his three-point shooting this past year. Is he really didn't have much. Like there's a lot of too many deep threes. I think he'll have better looks this season, and I think he showed flashes down the stretch as he did as a freshman, down the stretch of being able to create, but not necessarily from distance. Being able to get to his 15-footer, being able to finish with both hands at the rim. I think he kind of comes out as one of the leading scorers in the conference, somewhere at 15 or 16 maybe. Which sounds like a lot for a Butler team, but I think you're going to see Butler put up a lot more points this season because Tadmana just played the faster style of basketball. Creighton's a really tough team to figure out who your second team all conference guy is. kind of take your pick, honestly.
Right.
You could include two if you want: Trey Alexander, Ryan Nembhard, Arthur Kaluma, Baylor Shireman. Any of them can be all conference. I went with Ryan Nembhard. He was my Big East freshman of the year pick in the preseason last year. He ended up winning it. I'm riding with Nembhard when he's healthy. I think he's extremely good. He's my second team guy for Creighton, but really take your pick out of any of those guys. Take your pick of two if you want. And then I rounded out with Pasha Alexander, who I think is probably the most second team guy that can leap into the first team. Probably gets a little bit of a drop to my second team because I'm not convinced St. John's is going to be a tournament quality team, which kind of just hits him. But he's a really good creator, the best perimeter defender in the conference. And I don't think anyone is really in his same league in that area. And I think he'll be the go-to piece for the Red Storm.
Who wins the conference in the regular season, and what's that thing that kind of lifts that team above everyone else?
I'll go with Creighton because I think that they have roster continuity at the main positions, and they bring back 4 out of 5 guys. Mm-hmm. 4 other starters played for the team last year most of the way. I think they're going to probably end up starting Nembhard, Alexander, Kaluma, and Kalkbrenner again. And I think bringing back a coach also helps. So I think that's probably the edge over Villanova there. Is Villanova will have at least, obviously Kyle Neptune probably won't change much. Long-time assistant under Jay Wright. But I think that there's a learning curve there that I think Creighton just has an overall continuity edge in that respect.
Greg McDermott's a pretty good coach.
Excellent. Yes, very good head coach.
I might be the president of the Greg McDermott fan club at this point. Super impressed by his just making quality teams out of completely different types of teams, right? I mean, and then this year, I think there's an argument that this is the most well-rounded Creighton team he's ever had. If the offense takes a marginal step forward, I don't even know what that word means, a step forward that you'd like them to take into a quality of offense that can be in the realm of national title contender, then you've got some balance there that even those best teams, the team that finished 12th at KenPom, that's still a team that was a sub 75 KenPom defense. And there might be some balance between both sides of the floor that I don't think he's had before, which is an exciting proposition, assuming that the offense takes a step forward.
Yeah, speaking of really good Creighton teams, I think I said earlier that they made the Sweet 16 this past year. I meant 2 years ago.
We got you. We can edit it out. No, we don't do that. We don't do that around here. No, I'm kidding. Lucas, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us about the Big East. It is always a pleasure to have you on the pod.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.